Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. And in this 7th video in our series on content from Chapter 1, we ask the question about differing economic systems. How do we measure economic performance, and therefore, how can we compare our measurements from country to country? Indeed, the topic of this lecture, as you can see here in the title slide, measuring economic performance. Now, you may ask yourself the question, okay, different countries and different governments certainly have different economic systems, but why do we measure individual countries and their economic performance? Well, we measure a system's performance using various economic indicators, which are statistics, generally speaking, statistics that show whether an economic system is growing stronger, growing weaker, or remaining stable. These kinds of indicators help us to assess the overall performance of an economy. And why do we measure these kinds of things? Well, because there is an old true adage in business. You cannot improve what you cannot first control, and you cannot control what you cannot first measure. You cannot improve what you cannot first control, and you cannot control what you cannot first measure. Being able to accurately measure performance is absolutely crucial to getting control of an economic system, and you get control of an economic system in order to try to improve performance. Improving performance is important for individual citizens and their way of life, their standard of living, important for individual companies so they can earn more profit and grow their companies and improve the society in which they exist. Important for entire industries to grow so that entire economic systems and economies in nations can grow and lift an entire population of citizens up. All of these things are crucial, and begin with learning how to measure. Some of the things we take into account as we're measuring, we try to understand that certain industries have particular business cycles. What's a business cycle? The pattern of up and down, short-term, up and down expansions and contractions in an economy. Sometimes this happens naturally over time. Sometimes it's restricted to entirely specific industries. For instance, if you were in an industry that, for instance, made toys to the American public, you realize your performance will be cyclical based upon very high sales during what season of the year? Yes, that's right, during the winter time in anticipation of Christmas. And perhaps during other months, a little lower than that. We take those kinds of activities, the cyclical pattern of ups and downs, not only in an industry, but also in an entire economy, into consideration. What are we measuring? We're measuring overall aggregate output. And that's defined by the text there as the total quantity of goods and services produced by an economic system during a given period. Typically, that given period, of course, is one calendar year. That's how we compare these things. And what we're looking at is the total overall quantity of goods and service produced during that given year. In fact, as it says right there, that second point, this is the primary measure of growth in a business cycle. All of these things contribute to our standard of living. See, they're defined by the text as the total quantity and quality of goods and services that people can purchase with the currency used in their economic system. And so these are things we're very, very interested in, especially what is the overall output of an economic system, and therefore what is the standard of living that results for people living in that economic system. One of the primary measures we use to measure economic performance is called gross domestic product, oftentimes referred to as the acronym GDP. And gross domestic product refers to the total value of all goods and services produced within a given period by a national economy through domestic factors of production. In other words, factors of production which live and exist within the borders of that country. This is the measure of aggregate output. And you can see here the measures taken from the textbook, table 1.2 in your text, In 2015, in trillions of dollars, our gross domestic product was 17.95, almost $18 trillion. And the growth rate in 2015, 2.4% growth. As a result, on average, the average purchasing power parity in adjusted US dollars per capita, per person in the United States, a little bit shy of $56,000 a year of purchasing power, of GDP per capita. That refers to then our standard of living. Now, the reason why we talk about both GDP and GDP per capita is that GDP refers, of course, to the total value of all goods and services during that calendar year in the US, whereas GDP per capita means per person, is simply taking that number and dividing it by the number of people in the United States in this particular calendar year, and then you find out what is the amount of production per person. GDP per capita is certainly a more accurate way to compare economic performance between countries with dissimilar populations. And so if you're not talking about two countries of approximately the same population, it's very difficult to compare performance to performance simply by comparing GDP numbers, right? Because the billions of dollars produced in a country is going to be greatly affected by how many working people you have in the country, and GDP per capita adjusts for smaller or larger populations. And in this chart, figure 1.3 from your textbook, you begin to see how not only has GDP been rising over the years from 1950 to 2015, but also you see the increase in GDP per capita, or standard of living, for citizens in the United States during those same calendar years. What we're trying to measure then, when we talk about economic growth, is one of the major factors is productivity. Productivity is, as you see they're defined there, a measure of economic growth that compares how much a system produces with the resources needed to produce it. And of course, when you talk about how much you produce with a certain quantity of resources, what you're really talking about is efficiency. How efficiently do you use the factors of production? So let's give you an example. This is just an example, imaginary example out of the textbook, right? So if you could say with two elements of production, and if that was the cost of the leather used to make soccer balls and the labor required, labor hours of a worker, let's, for example, say that it takes one U.S. worker and the equivalent of $1 US of resources to produce 10 soccer balls in an 8-hour workday. Versus in Saudi Arabia, perhaps it takes the equivalent of 1.2 Saudi workers and $1.5 US, or the equivalent of that in reals, to produce the same 10 soccer balls in an 8-hour work period. We would therefore be able to conclude with the same amount of time it takes US production, less labor hours, and less resources to produce the same output as it does for workers and resource usage and efficiency in Saudi Arabia. And thus we would conclude that with regards to soccer balls in this theoretical imaginary example, US has greater efficiency, that the US is more efficient in producing soccer balls. And of course, this is just one example. You cannot conclude from this example that the US is more efficient in producing everything, from soccer balls to automobiles to fine wool suits to shoes. And no, of course, we're just talking about efficiency in one particular area of production. Well, overall productivity is an attempt to measure and aggregate efficiency to find out the relative efficiencies of entire economic systems in production. And there are some things that get in the way of productivity considerations, one of which is the balance of trade, and the other is national debt. So let's take a look at these things one at a time. The balance of trade refers to the positive or negative balance of the economic value of all products the country exports, in other words, products that are made domestically and then shipped overseas for sale, minus the economic value of imported products, products made elsewhere that are then imported into the country to be sold to domestic consumers. National debt refers to the amount of money that the government owes to creditors, money that must be borrowed from the same financial system where resources and capital might otherwise go to the means of production. So let's take a closer look at the balance of trade. You see here historically from 1990 to 2016, the U.S. balance of trade in millions of dollars. Why are the bars going down instead of up? Well, it's because the U.S. has run for decades a negative balance of trade, which means that we import more stuff than we export out to other countries to the tune of millions and millions of dollars. So what does that mean? Well, it could mean that we don't produce enough stuff to satisfy American consumers, which would mean that our production is relatively inefficient. With regards to the United States, that's not really the case. That's only one possible explanation, but really perhaps the better and more insightful explanation is simply that U.S. consumers, because of our relatively high standard of living and disposable income, U.S. consumers love to buy stuff. We love to have choices. We love to have imported goods like German automobiles and Japanese electronics. We just love to have that stuff. And so our balance of trade reflects more the fact that we are a consumer nation with huge appetites and a fair amount of disposable income per capita in order to buy a bunch of imported stuff in addition to the stuff that we make and produce domestically. However, the balance of trade is a reflection of overall national productivity. Now, what does this all mean? It means that there are several chief significant ways we measure the economic performance of a particular economic system. These are the kinds of things we keep track of in, for instance, mainstay business publications like the Wall Street Journal or The Economist. Things that we continue to track for some folks who are in business, to track this on a daily basis to see where are we as a nation compared to other nations. There are a lot of other considerations in this. Remember that this class is an overview of business, and therefore we sort of give you a flavor for some of the dominant ways we try to look at these topics, like gross domestic product as a measure of overall national performance of our domestic economic system. What does this mean? It means we live in a global village. We are one economic system in a marketplace with many economic systems. And the fact that we can measure our performance means that we have a better handle on being able to understand how to control and improve economic performance. What does, for instance, unemployment have to do with our economic performance and stability? What does inflation and recession perhaps have to do with our economic performance and therefore our standard of living? These are all the kinds of topics that we talk about not only in this lecture but in the next video to come, to consider in the big macro view, the umbrella view of our entire nation. How is business affected by our economic performance? And therefore we as businesswomen and businessmen, how should we decide and analyze and strategize on behalf of our organizations and our own careers? Hope this is helpful. We'll see you in the next lecture.